Oklahoma Gardening is a production of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the land grant mission of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University, dedicated to improving the quality of life of the citizens of Oklahoma through research-based information. Underwriting assistance for our program is provided by the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing. Today on Oklahoma Gardening, host Casey Hentges reveals the results of our viewers' favorite herbs poll. We use our senses for a scavenger hunt at the Botanic Garden. OSU turfgrass specialist Justin Moss has tips for deciding when to turn on the sprinklers. And we dig into some research on invasive worms in Oklahoma.
Recently, we asked you, our viewers, for your top 5 herbs to grow in the garden, and we're here today with the results that we came up with.
Plant number 1.
You all must enjoy making pesto or caprese salads because your number 1 herb choice to grow is basil. But again, the question was, which one do you prefer growing, not necessarily which you prefer eating. But again, it's no wonder that basil was the winner because basil is such an easy plant to grow in the garden. The nice thing about basil is it's also a great plant to add as a patio or container garden plant. Now, you can easily get it either by transplants or seedling. A lot of time there's a lot more seeds that might be available through the internet for you. Now, the one thing you want to be cautious of is you can save the seeds from year to year if you want to, but if you plant more than one variety, within a couple hundred feet, they might cross-pollinate. So you might be getting actually a different basil than what you're expecting to save for the next year. Other than that, basil is a great addition to the garden, and you really only need 1 or 2 plants to feed a family.
Plant number 2.
Your number 2 pick is rosemary, and it's no wonder because it's a nice shrub to add to your herb garden. Now, the thing about rosemary is it is from the Mediterranean, so it likes a little bit more of a drier, sandy soil. So if you have Oklahoma clay soils, you might try planting this in a container where it'll allow it to dry out a little bit in between. It's one that can be sensitive to our winters, but ARP is a cultivar that is actually touted as being more cold tolerant.
Plant number 3.
Most gardeners will agree that you can never have too much time in the garden, but in this particular case, we're talking about the plant time. And it comes in a couple of different forms, but whichever cultivar of thyme you get, you're going to be adding a nice softness to your garden with its petite foliage that it adds. Because thyme is a perennial, meaning it'll come back the next year, you want to make sure to quit trimming it as you get into the fall so that it's allowed to harden off for the season. Also, thyme is another Mediterranean herb, so it works well in drought conditions, one that you might again add to your patio garden or in a container, or maybe even in a bottle.
Plant number 4.
Cilantro is one of those herbs that I think you either love it or hate it, but apparently you, our viewers, love growing it in the garden. Now, cilantro is a cool season herb, which means as those temperatures start to rise, you're going to see your plant rise also, which is called bolting, as the foliage really starts to sprout up. Now, after you're done harvesting the foliage for cilantro, all is not lost because once these flowers start to bloom and set seed, that is what we know as coriander.
Plant number 5.
Last but certainly not least is the mint plant, and you really don't even have to be a cook to enjoy this plant as it's a nice addition to any summer drink. You also really don't need to be much of a gardener in order to grow this plant. Now, the mint plant comes in an array of colors and textures and smells and fragrances, so you can really customize the look that you're going for or the smell or flavor you're going for in your garden. Mint can be a little bit of a bully, so feel free to harvest as much as you want from this plant. Because it can be a bully in the garden, you might want to use it in a container. If you want that look of growing it in the ground, go ahead and plant it in a container, but then sink that container down into the soil, leaving about a 1-inch lip just to ensure that it doesn't get out into the garden. There you have it. Those are your top 5 herbs to grow in the garden. And while our survey may have limited you to choosing just 5, thankfully you can choose as many as you want to plant in your garden. If you come visit us here at the Botanic Garden at Oklahoma State University, don't forget to check out our formal sensory garden. But really, any garden that you visit is about experiencing that garden using your senses. Dr. Shelley Mitchell, Extension Specialist for Horticulture and Youth Development, is here to share some fun ideas to get those kids out there exploring the garden using their senses.
Okay, like Casey said, you can turn any garden, or any piece of earth for that matter, into a sensory garden or a scavenger hunt using your senses. So if you're looking for something to keep the kids occupied and you want something for the kids to do that'll like make them observe better, you can use a scavenger hunt. So these are examples of boards you can find online. These are just on bandanas. But you can also make your own. So you can take a piece of poster board or a piece of paper and brainstorm different things you know might be out there. So for instance, touch. You can have them look for a fuzzy caterpillar. Or you could say, go find a buzzing insect. Or you could say, like, here's a smell a pinch of soil. Or take a deep breath and get some clean air. So these are just some ideas. You can look for insects, you can look for tree parts, you can look for flowers, you can look at cactus spines. But when you use any kind of sensory scavenger hunt, you're really letting the kids use their senses of observation. So for example, if you want to use this as a game, what you can do is you can make it like a bingo game. And so you could have a kid or a group of kids form a team, and somebody could be mulch and somebody could be rocks. And as you find different things on the board, you can put your piece on it. So let's say you found some insect eggs. Then, the rock team found some insect eggs. And then the mulch team, they found a gall, which is a swelling around insect eggs laid in a plant, so like oak leaf galls. So they'd put their little mulch piece here. And then the rock team also found a gall. All right? And so then as you find different things, the teams would come and they would put their pieces. And then as soon as one team gets a bingo, then you come back and you either you take them to where you found the insect galls, or if you have a leaf that you can bring, you bring that. And all the kids go over all the things people found, and so they all get to benefit from everybody's powers of observation, and they all get a little chance to look at nature just a little bit more in depth. Another thing you can do, which is completely free, is use those paint chips that you collected when you were deciding what colors to paint your walls or your furniture or whatever it is you're painting. Or you can just go to the paint stores, like, the big box stores, and they'll usually let you have these for free. So what you can do is you can see if you can find these colors in the garden. And at first, you're like, where am I going to find those shades? But you'd be surprised at how easy it is to match these shades almost exactly. So we'll take one here. This one, for instance. And this one we happen to find on a little cluster of flowers. So those little flowers are about the same color as that paint chip card. Bench, bittersweet orange. Cactus, candy stripe red paint swatch. Indian blanket, atomic red paint swatch. Pot, blue. Prove me wrong. So as you can see, no matter what you have around you, you can make a really fun scavenger hunt and use your senses to explore your world.
Summertime's coming here in Oklahoma, and pretty soon it's going to dry out, and it's time to start thinking about irrigating our yards. So what I have here, just to demonstrate, is a soil moisture probe, just to see where would we be at with our soil moisture after a rain. So it just so happens it's just rained recently here. So I've got this soil moisture probe in the ground. I take a reading, and it's actually giving me a value in this soil here, which is somewhat of a high clay content soil of over 50%. So what that's telling me is this soil has actually been rained on recently, and it's saturated right now. So what happens is you'll get a rainfall. If it's a good rainfall, the soil will become saturated. The big water droplets will come out and it will drain. So the macropores will drain, and then what you have left there after about 24 hours is something we call field capacity for soil moisture in the soil. After that, the soil is obviously going to dry out over time, and eventually it's going to get to a point where we need to irrigate again. So how do we know when it's time to irrigate our lawn? Typically in Oklahoma in the summertime, the demand for the grasses in our yard or for our landscape is going to be somewhere roughly near about 1 inch of water per week. So if we take into account the water that's evaporating out of the soil plus the water that the plant is going to use, it's roughly going to be somewhere around 1 inch of water per week. Now we can get a lot closer if we have a weather station nearby us, or if we have somewhere to get some data, or if we just monitor the soil moisture with a soil moisture probe. So these probes can be hooked up to an irrigation system, and it can monitor it in real time, and if the soil is wet, it's not going to water. If the soil dries out, the system will come on and water for you. In the same way, you can get weather data hooked up to your irrigation station. And if it has rained recently, it's going to sense that it has rained with a rain sensor. It's going to turn your system off. And then when it dries up, it's going to water based on the need, based on that climate data. So really neat things we can use. We call that smart irrigation controls. And July happens to be Smart Irrigation Month for the Irrigation Association. So what we want to do is be smart about how we water our yard. If it's recently rained, we don't want to water, let it dry out and rain again. Think about that house plant you got in the home. If you water it every day, it's actually not good for it. It may even die. If you let it dry out in between waterings, that house plant's going to be a lot healthier. Think of your lawn and your landscape in the same way.
Joining us today is Dr. Scott Loss with the Natural Resource Ecology and Management Department. And Dr. Loss, you've got an interesting topic we wanted to talk to you today about. First of all, we were going to talk about worms. And a lot of times I think we think worms are a great thing to have in the garden, but you've got some news to share with us.
Right, so probably a lot of people are taught from a young age that earthworms are an important part of the ecosystem, and that certainly is the case, but it's a little more complicated than that. In places like Oklahoma and a lot of the US, we have native earthworms, but we also now have a large number of non-native earthworms from places like Europe and Asia. And ecological researchers have been studying whether these non-native earthworms have negative effects on the environment for about 20 years or so in places like the upper Midwest of the US and Canada, northeastern US and New England, and some of the things they found are very surprising.
So this isn't a recent thing. I mean, it's not something that just happened. We just never really think about invasive worms, I guess.
In a lot of places, these non-native worms have probably been established for decades to hundreds of years even.
Okay.
Soon after Europeans came here, they were doing things that probably brought earthworms, like transferring soil and plants between the Old World and Western Hemisphere.
So how are we seeing some of the effects of these invasive worms? How are they affecting our environment?
So the effects of non-native worms are especially dramatic in places that don't have any earthworms historically. So places in the northern parts of North America that were previously glaciated especially, if there were native earthworms there, they would have been wiped out by the glaciation.
Okay.
And so they naturally now don't have native earthworms. But since settlement...
So like New York and up there?
Places north of, say, central Illinois,
Okay.
Iowa, into the northern Midwest, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, into northern New England are places above the glacier line where there aren't native earthworms, or there historically are not any native earthworms. And all that you have there now are non-native species. And those non-native species have also become established in places south of that where there are native earthworms as well, like here in Oklahoma.
Okay. So what are we seeing in those areas, especially where there's non-natives up in the north?
Right.
What's it doing to the environment up there?
So soils in those environments that adapted without earthworms have decomposition systems that are really slow. They're based on things like fungus and bacteria. And when you get a big decomposer like an earthworm into those types of environments, you're essentially stepping on the gas pedal of decomposition. And most gardeners probably know that decomposition is a really important process for the soil and for plants, and when you change the speed of it, it can have really important impacts. So when these non-native earthworms get established, we see really big changes to the soil. It gets mixed up. The density of the soil actually increases overall in environments that didn't have earthworms historically, and the earthworms eat away the organic matter and the leaf litter layer in these soils.
So does that affect the plants that might grow there and the animals that might use that space?
Yeah, so there's a large diversity of native plants in forests of the eastern U.S. that rely on a really healthy organic layer and leaf litter layer. And when the worms get into these areas and remove that, a lot of these plant species do poorly. So think things like trilliums, Solomon seals, some other species have really declined in forests where non-native earthworms have gotten into place.
So basically you're looking at it here in Oklahoma. What can we do here to help this situation, and what are we seeing?
Yeah, so here in Oklahoma, there hasn't been a lot of research on earthworms, period, including non-native earthworms. So when I came here as a new faculty member in NREM about 6 years ago, I had a research background in this from working in places like Upper Midwest, and I was very interested in whether there are non-native earthworms here. There are native earthworms in Oklahoma, and some of our digging into this issue has shown that we have a wide variety of non-native species present here in Oklahoma as well, not only in places like urban neighborhoods and parks, but also in forests and prairies of the state.
So how do we find out what's underground here?
Yeah, so when we do our scientific sampling of earthworms, there's a few different methods that can be used. One popular method that really depends on appropriate soil conditions, the soil has to be relatively moist and it has to be permeable, is something we call the liquid mustard extraction technique. And to use this technique, we use typical household mustard, ground yellow mustard seed that you can buy at a co-op in bulk. We mix about 1/3 of a cup of this ground yellow mustard seed with water, a gallon of water, shake it up, and we pour it onto the surface of the soil. And that mustard contains a skin irritant that causes the worms to want to come to the surface, and we're able to just sample them off the surface that way.
So it doesn't harm them, it allows you to kind of see them though.
Yeah, it's an irritant, but it's not a fatal approach to sampling them. They can go back to being unharmed after we look at the worms.
Okay, and so some of the ones that we're bringing up, what are those that we're looking at?
Yeah, so there's a couple different varieties that we tend to sample a lot here in Oklahoma. Like I said, we have a native group of earthworms. There's a wide variety of native earthworm species here in Oklahoma, and they play an important role in the soil. But what we also have found is a group of, especially in central Oklahoma and places like prairies, we find a group of earthworms in the genus Aporectidea, which is a group of earthworms from Eurasia, and we're not certain what types of effects they're having in our soils and to our plant communities here yet, but that's the type of research that we're engaging on now here in Oklahoma.
So for the Oklahoma backyard gardener who might be doing composting, or a fisherman here, I mean, there's a lot of worms that you can buy. Are those invasive or native worms that we're buying?
Yeah, for fishing, it's unfortunate that virtually all of the earthworms that get used for fishing bait are European or Asian species that include some of the ones that have been shown to have some pretty harmful effects on the environment in other regions. So Even the night crawler, the common night crawler, which we probably often think of as a native component of our ecosystem, is a non-native species from Europe, and it's even marketed under names like the Canadian crawler, which makes us think that it's native, but it's really from Eurasia. There's a variety of other common bait species used as well, and they all tend to be non-native. And what we say, not that you have to stop using those species for bait, but if you are using earthworm bait, to not throw unused bait on the ground when you're done, to instead dispose of it properly in a garbage to keep from propagating another invasion in a place where you go fishing.
Okay.
For composting, there's again a wide variety of worms that are used. One of the most commonly used ones is called the red wiggler, also just called the compost worm sometimes. Its scientific name is Yeugeniya Malyutina. That species is non-native, but it's not thought to have major negative impacts. It doesn't do very well in very cold or very hot conditions, so it doesn't get widely established outside of compost bins. Okay. There are other species that are being marketed that can have harmful effects. Species such as marketed under names like Alabama jumper or Texas jumper. They sound again like native species, but those are actually a group of Asian earthworms called the Asian jumping worm. Okay. So we recommend not using those just in case they get out of your compost bin and into the environment.
All right, well, thanks for that information. And let's go take a look at some of the research that one of your grad students is doing. Joining us is Yeugeniya, who is a graduate student in the NREM department, and she's actually doing her research on invasive worms. So you're doing a lot of digging out here.
Yeah,
we're at one of the OSU's range research facilities. And tell me exactly what we're looking for.
Well, we're looking for both native and non-native worms. There's all kinds of native ones here, and there's only one kind of, or a couple of kinds of non-native ones. And so I just come out here, especially after it rains, and I go digging for them.
All right, so you're sifting by hand through some of this soil. And does the soil texture actually affect the worms that you might be finding a little bit? Or how to find them?
Yeah, so this is just what I've observed, so it's nothing like in the literature, but I've noticed that where there's more clay in the soil, I've been finding more of the native smaller worms, but where there's a bit less clay, I've been finding more of the bigger ones and the non-native ones.
Okay, so you've kind of probed this area and you found that this spot might be a good area to dig for worms, so you've been coming out here, is that?
Yep, pretty consistently.
So what are you hoping to find with this research?
Well, we're looking at how the non-natives and the native worms comparatively affect the fungi communities that are in the soil, specifically mycorrhizal fungi, which a lot of the plants around here depend on. They actually need that fungi to survive. They are AMF dependent, so to speak. And so if these non-natives are affecting them negatively, we're looking at how that might translate for the plant community around.
So a lot of times we hear different things about how, you know, the worms take the seeds to different levels and that can affect the plants. Also maybe the surface area with the leaf litter. So you're looking at a different aspect.
Yes, I'm looking specifically at the fungus.
So there's a lot to eliminate. I mean, once you find that correlation, there's numerous reasons maybe even for that correlation.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe in time we'll be seeing the effects of it around here in Oklahoma.
So is there also a potential correlation between native plants where you find these native worms versus invasive plants and invasive worms? So
that might be a part of my project, but actually Scott Loss, my advisor, he's been having his students do a whole project on that and how different non-native grass species like Old World Big Blue Stem and what kind of worm communities they might have there. So maybe the non-native worms are more where these non-native plants are.
So there's research on that going on too.
Yes.
Well, it'll be exciting to find out what happens and where maybe some of these worms are living and affecting our plant communities as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you for sharing this with us.
Thank you.
There are lots of great horticultural events this time of year. Be sure and consider these activities when you're making your plans for the weeks ahead. Next week, we highlight one of your favorite herbs. Students from OSU's Camp Turf join us with garden safety tips. Keith Reed, the OSU Extension horticulturalist for Payne County, rides by with info on summer cover crops. Casey stakes our tomatoes, and Barbara Brown cooks a tasty dish. We hope you join us then for more TV you'll grow to love. To find out more information about show topics, as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure and visit our website, oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. And we always have great information, answers to questions, photos, and gardening discussions on your favorite social media as well. Join in on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows, as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater jewel. We would like to thank our generous underwriter, the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is also provided by Pond Pro Shop, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, the Oklahoma Horticultural Society, and the Tulsa Garden Club.